Anyway, Liz is about to launch a buyer's guide to the rosés of southern France, which she's tasted about 1,000 wines and kept about 850 in the guide. And the theme for today is rosé from Pays d'Oc. And of course, what we tend to overlook when Provence makes such a noise about its rosés is actually a lot more wine is produced in the Languedoc, or rosé is produced in the Languedoc than in Provence. So Liz is going to tell us about some of the unusual grape varieties that are used in the Languedoc for rosé. So Liz, over to you.
Great. Hello. Thank you very much. There was a sort of request fairly on in the planning that I divert some of the attention towards climate change. So I will be talking about rosé, but the bulk of this talk is going to be the rare varieties and climate change and going into rosés on a sideline. So that's just to sort of give a bit of a background. As I've said, questions are, I'm welcome to have questions during the talk. And I'll explain as I go along. I think that might be best. So let's just, are you seeing that without all the bits on the side? Is that okay?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so the title is sort of mutated into grape varieties and climate change in Pays d'Oc. Right. Okay, so the history. This is something that is very, very much the focus of absolutely everything that IGP Pays d'Oc or Pays d'Oc IGP talk about, dating back to the 1980s with the incredibly charming Jacques Gravegel, who is still very much involved. And this idea that Languedoc is the French California is their focus on where they're going. And so this had to be an obligatory part of the talk. But I think what's quite important is that while we think about the grape varieties and the California approach, we actually think about IGP as an entity. So you can see terroir is a small specific area and territoire is a large area. And discovered this week that actually the appellations copyrighted the word terroir, so that IGPs throughout France cannot say that their wine comes from terroir, but only from a territoire, which I think is very important because it shifts the emphasis in a slightly different way. So what does the IGP do? It controls the maximum yields. Each IGP is slightly different. It regulates the varieties and the blends, and it has quality control. So Pays d'Oc do taste all the wines before it goes in bottle, and that supposedly guarantees the quality. The other thing I want to point out is the logo for IGP Pays d'Oc along the left-hand side, liberty of expression, with this long list of grape varieties, which harks back to this idea of IGP Pays d'Oc being the California of France, being variety driven as opposed to an assemblage, a blend. So where is IGP Pays d'Oc? So do I get my little sort of thing there? So you're up here, aren't you, Rosemary? Can you see that? No. Laser pointer. You're up here. Is that right? When you're in France?
Hang on, where I can't see your laser.
Yep. Up there towards
no, you
come
there.
Somewhere.
Yes, down a bit. So Fougère Cabrières.
That's it.
Down a bit.
So it is a vast area, and I know Rosemary's there because we've tasted lots of rosé together when we've been there. But all these little appellations, and I did a couple of tastings at Vinisud a couple of years back, where each appellation said, "Can you show our appellation why it's unique?" So of course they have the wines that express the ultimate in the appellation and show the differences. And a number of buyers got very excited and they bought wine from all these different appellations and then said, you go back to the UK and you try and show people in your elevator pitch, this is why this wine is different from another wine. And they're all made from the GSM blend, or a lot of them, and it is very much of a muchness, which is where IGP Paydoc leap in, and they cover vineyards all over, in between the appellations as well. So it's not just defined by the appellation, but you will get, I'd say the majority of producers have wine in their local appellation and in IGP Paydoc. So next. Oop, I've lost my mouse completely. Oop. Sorry. I shouldn't have done that laser thing, should I? I now can't move to the next slide. Ah. How do I do that? Sorry about that. Can anyone take over the screen to move to the next slide for me?
Liz, try tapping the escape button a couple of times, top left.
Aha, well done, Stephen. Yeah, techno wizard there. So this is also the logo for IGP Paydoc, which is I like because it just shows the share variety and the freedom of creativity throughout the region. So this is we're getting down to the hard facts and figures here. This is the volume of the grape varieties that are produced. And I find it really quite scary, the sheer amount of Merlot, Cabernet, Syrah, and even Pinot that is produced, along with Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc. So these classic varieties, the Bordeaux style varieties, these were the initial varieties planted because if you're California and France, you have these big Cabernets and Merlots and Chardonnays and Sauvignon Blancs being planted. And they are still the main varieties. You go to a supermarket in France, it may not even say the name of the producer, it will just have Merlot on the label. This is the bulk. I think 85% of wine sold in the Paydoc is varietal wine coming from IGP Paydoc. It's a vast volume. But what is interesting is where you see these other little grape varieties creeping up at the bottom, which is really what we're going to be talking about today. So the website with this logo says we have 58 varieties. And I went through everything and I kept on coming up with this magic number 56. And I kept on saying, well, what are the others? If you say you have 58, but everywhere is listed is 56, what are they? And nobody ever really wants to talk about it. So I had to go to the cahier de charge for this list of grape varieties. And of course, there aren't 56, there are even more. And these are the varieties that are used and can be used in IGP Paydoc wine. All of these, apart from the cépage secondaire and the third column, can be used 100% in making wine, which is quite a phenomenal range of grape varieties. And obviously not all of them will be suitable. I've never tasted Portan as a varietal, so I guess that's possibly put in blends. But this amazing range of grapes. So what happens with IGP Paydoc is a producer will say, I really fancy planting Riesling. And this is what I've understood. It's not been terribly clear. It goes to the syndicat. The syndicat then investigates, is Riesling going to be suitable in Languedoc? I don't understand the criteria of how they determine it will be suitable, but within a very short number of years, much shorter than for an appellation, a grape variety can be added onto the list. So this is an ongoing growing list of grape varieties. But not all of them are growing in volume. And what is fascinating is that Columbar seems to have grown more than any other variety out of all of these listed here. Columbar never struck me as being the world's greatest gourmet grape variety to be planting in such enormous quantities. So we're going to be looking at that in a minute. So the top 4 varietal wines: Merlot, Cabernet Syrah, Pinot, the red wines, with Cabernet Franc, Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc. They were planted back in the 80s, even though they knew back in the 80s that it was at the extreme edge of the temperature range. But I don't know if any of you remember when Mazda Domus Gassac was started up and people were kind of going, this is going to be the Bordeaux of Languedoc. And they had lots of sort of research going into the soils. This is what was going to happen. So I was speaking to Professor Alain Deloire, who said he is very happy if anyone wants to get in touch with him for anything more on the story about this. And he was telling me how he works at Subagro in Montpellier, how scientists investigating the varieties that can be planted in Languedoc, there is a fair amount of frustration because they're not interested in the marketing of the varieties. They're interested in the quality of the grape varieties within the climate of Languedoc. But it takes time. So Marcelin and Caladoc took 30 years from initial testing. Caladoc from 58, Marcelin from 61, authorized in 1991. Today, crossings take around 10 years. Mrs. Vitis vinifera crossings. They then have to go through the system of approval, which can take another 10 years if it's for an appellation. But producers generally plant on a 40-year cycle. You can't afford to replant every time you think of another grape variety. So scientists themselves are very, very frustrated that they can come up with all sorts of ideas of new grape varieties that would be good, just the length of time it takes to get those varieties through. So this is from an MW trip to Roussillon 2019. We went to a research station where we tasted, you can see my Assertico note in the background, where we tasted a load of the varieties being experimented on for the Roussillon. So Cabernet Cortis, which I know from tasting more in Central Europe, Muscaris from Germany, Greek varieties. They are very, very keen on introducing Greek varieties into the Languedoc-Roussillon. Feel that they will deal with the drought. No, there isn't a Q&A function. I'm just doing it via chat, Stephen, if there are any questions. So yeah, very, very keen on the Greek varieties. Souvigné Gris. This is also Antarontes. So that's just some of the grape varieties that they're experimenting with. So we should be able to see in a couple of years some quite unusual grape varieties being added to the blend. So I just wanted to look a bit at why this is important is the climate change. And Rosemary had mentioned rosé. So I've just come out of this tasting of 1,000 rosés from southern France, and 2020 was a particularly hot, dry vintage. And what that meant was that there was an enormous amount of rosés that just didn't have the fruit. They hadn't ripened sufficiently. So producers whom I knew produced very good rosé in previous years, 2020, the fruit just wasn't there. So that is something that is going to be quite important. But the climate change isn't just a growth in heat, it is in the extremes, as we all know. So like the frosts we had in April, flash flooding. So the grapes are all over the place in how they're dealing with it. With the temperatures, this is something we're going to be talking about later on in the talk. I thought it was quite interesting how Languedoc, I don't know, have you ever been to a vineyard where they say, oh, well, we have a big diurnal temperature change. It's hot during the day and it's cool at night. And you then spend the rest of that night in your press trip hotel room wishing there was air conditioning because it's not cooler at night. So it is this sort of very minuscule hot cold difference. But I was quite curious, the map on the left, which is from the 70s, 80s and 90s, showing it seems to be cooler on the southern slopes of the Black Mountains in Minervois. So it's not always the north-facing slopes, it's also the exposition and the soil that is going to alter the temperature for where they're planting the grapes. With the evolution of temperatures, well, we've seen this everywhere really, just going up and up and up. So and this ends in 2011, so going to be going up even further. So this, I just mentioned before we're going on to this grapevine, I was talking to IGP Paydoc and I said, do you have any statistics or maps or information about climate change in the Paydoc IGP? And the reaction was no. We have lots of information about the grape varieties, but we haven't yet moved forward to any analysis on what is going to be happening. So I'm very sorry if my maps are and charts are not always Languedoc IGP doc related. So this is from, as I said, Alain Deloire Subagro. And one of the things they're talking about is training the vines. And the little goblet vines that we see, say, in Châteauneuf-du-Pape are very good because they've got small canopy because they're small and withstand the temperature much, much better. But the downside is you can't mechanize. But there is this grape for training called Palmette, which I somehow or other forgot to, oh yes I did, Palmette, which apparently is a traditional Roman style of vine training. And there is one vineyard they are experimenting with. He said not to mention them because it's still experimental, but this is a style of vine training that they're very keen to encourage and that we should start seeing more of in Languedoc-Roussillon, so that they have the same canopy as Goblet, with less transpiration, but because of their height and the fact that they can be trained a little bit in line, it can allow for vineyards to be mechanized. So talking to Subagro further, which grape varieties would they recommend? Traditional varieties which cope with drought and heat, which we all know about, nothing new. But what we're not anticipating is early budding varieties such as Grenache and Syrah, which get hit by the frosts. So back in April, when the big frosts hit, even in Languedoc, people who had more veg, which is late budding, they were quite happy, they sailed through it. But Grenache and Syrah were early, and so there are these pockets of Grenache and Syrah that were wiped out. So these are varieties which are good for drought and heat, but are not going to necessarily be good with spring frosts, which we are getting more of. So the first wine, they actually sent me some wines, which you don't have and I do. So the first wine is a Grenache Gris from Old Vines. And what I particularly like with Grenache Gris is that it has a lot of texture. And I think actually we can probably contact IGP Paydoc if anyone wants to try tasting some of these. So the Grenache Gris seems to retain incredibly good acidity, but slightly textural acidity. So we're not looking at crisp, zesty type wines. We're looking at wines with slightly more chalky texture. This wine had a lot of very saline length. Lime, grapefruit pith, a very, very good weight. And it was a prime example of how a classic old style grape variety is going to be surviving. What was curious, on their website, they also have Tempranillo. So we're getting this is what you'll often find with IGP Paydoc. They will have traditional, completely weird and funky varieties, or an international variety from elsewhere. So this is one producer dealing with different sorts of grapes. The grapes that are better adapted to the heat is that they're going to be grape varieties that have much higher acidity. So Neoluccio was originally recommended to producers as being a variety that could be like Sanso. I don't know how many of you have tasted Neoluccio in Corsica and Sanso. I don't get an awful lot of similarity, but I expect somebody did. But this was how it was sold to producers. And as a grape variety that would be good blending in with red wines. In the tasting we've done this past month, we had 3 Neoluccio rosés from Languedoc-Roussillon. Very similar to Corsica in that they have that round, supple fruit, slightly more peachy than the red fruit in Corsica, but keeping the acidity beautifully. So whereas a lot of the classic Grenache Sansos were really struggling to get forward that fruit in the last vintage, Neoluccio did very well. Carignan is a secondary grape, but quite often added in to both red and rosé, just because it has that acidity which 100 years ago was regarded as astringent and really horrid, now gives beautiful freshness to some of those blends. Petit Manseng and Chenin Blanc. Now, I think these are both more evident now, and I presumed that Chenin Blanc was going to be a new thing in Languedoc, but one of the professors I spoke to said they've actually been uncovering, or discovering rather, 100-year-old Chenin Blanc all over Languedoc. So it's been known for a while. They've discovered some just outside Montpellier, that Chenin Blanc actually is a very good variety for giving that acidity and that character. And the wine that Petit Manseng, everyone was really keen on Petit Manseng because of the grape varieties. But one problem, remember I mentioned earlier that appellations putting a copyright on the word terroir. There are some appellations who are not happy with anyone else taking their grape variety. So Bellay, north of Nice, has blocked Braquet as a variety being adopted in the IGP Paydoc because it's a Bellay grape variety. And apparently some producers in the southwest are not happy with Petit Manseng being used in IGP Paydoc. It's all terribly partisan, but you know, it's going through. So I had 2 wines, the Colombar from the Minervois region, made by winemakers originally from Alsace. And I don't know about any of you how you would expect a Colombar to taste. I was expecting something slightly green and lean, as I'd only tasted it like that. And this was almost waxy, oily, fresh almonds, very weighty, bit of elderflower and a bit of grapefruit and some floral character. So really changing character in the south, in the heat, but retaining its acidity. And I've also got the Chenin Blanc from Limoux, which is made as a late harvest wine. So I spoke to Rive Blanc and I said, okay, Limoux, tell me about your climate change. So this is a quote from the producers at Rive Blanc. My records of harvests read like a catalogue of disasters. Too dry, 2016. Too many temperature shifts, 2017. Too wet, 2018. Too hot, 2019. Mildew in the hateful 2018. Frost in 2021. So this idea that the south of France has consistently good quality vintages every single year is a bit of a myth. But the Chenin Blanc has done very, very well, and it seems to motor through better than most other grape varieties. So maybe we will start seeing more Chenin Blanc in other places. So this comes back to, with the heat of the 2020 vintage that I noticed in the rosés, where they just did not have the aromatic character that I expected from the grape varieties. So there were quite a few Syrah, Grenache rosés, and I tasted these wines blind. So what we did was we organized the wines by grape variety or by region. So we knew that we had a flight of predominantly Syrah rosé. And the first wine we tasted, and I said, oh, we've messed up there. This is a Muscat rosé, isn't it? Second wine, another Muscat rosé. Not mentioned on the fiche technique, and all we could guess, didn't have time to follow all of it up, was that by adding 10% Muscat, which does not need to go on the list of grape varieties, but is enough to impact on the style of the wine, producers have been adding in, you can quote me on this very, very vaguely because I've got no absolute proof on this, producers are beginning to add in some of those aromatic Muscat varieties into the blend to supplement the loss of aromatic character lost on very hot summers. So we're going to get maybe a slight shift on standard grape varietals that we think we recognize, but they'll have some more of these aromatics. Right. Oops. Possible for future varieties, as I mentioned, Greek varieties. They're also looking at grape varieties from southern Italy, Fiano, Greco, Agliarico, not Agliarico, the other one beginning with G, Negromaro. So southern Italian varieties. Water. Yes, there is a shortage of water, as one can imagine, during the summer months. So coming on to water, we have humidity that causes diseases. But Marcelin, one of the grape varieties I mentioned earlier, I wrote an article about it for Gilsom a few weeks ago and Drinks Business. Very, very good in hot, humid areas. It was designed in Languedoc to be a variety good for Languedoc, which is why it's used a lot in places like China, Uruguay, and Israel. It's very, very resistant to humidity. So this is a grape variety that's very good, especially along the coastal area where there is more humidity. Caladoc, which is the sort of similar, created 2 years before Marcelin. A lot of rosés with Caladoc. From Provence, the Rhone, Languedoc. This is a variety that just cropped up everywhere. I thought it would be an unusual grape variety. Not a particularly exciting variety, I have to say. It did need good winemaking and it did do better in blends, I felt. But it's a variety that has good structure and that was able to carry the wine very well. And I tried a Caladoc for this tasting from Ricardel-Lautrec, a natural wine, and because of its resistance to disease, much more often found in natural winemaking or organic or sustainable vineyards. So again, a grape variety that we will be seeing far more of and is already appearing in a lot of blends. It's just been let into the appellations of Côte d'Aix, Côte de Rhône. So it is a variety to look out for along with Marcelin. So we have the water problem, we have the irrigation, but where does the water come from? One of the big problems with irrigation is that fruit, flowers, vegetables also want water. So they have to fit into a timing schedule that will allow for other agriculture to be watered, which is a problem. So this is Alain Deloise. Alain Deloise is a big fan of irrigation. And you can see he's quite keen on the idea of irrigation all throughout the growing season for optimal growth, but quite honest about that that's not going to be possible. But was saying that 300, how many rosés are made? Saignée or dedicated wines? Oh, I think it's 21% of long IGP PADOC production is rosé and growing every year. I would say the vast majority is made expressly to be rosé. It's big business, a lot of Grenache. So very little Saignée. In fact, the Saignée rosés are quite often the premium rosés because they're producers who actually understand what they're doing. Well, that was the experience we had on this tasting. So yeah, the majority are rosé. And one of the advantages of rosé over red with climate change is that you can harvest that bit earlier without getting that sort of sous-maturity alcohol and bulky fruit. And you can get away with a much lighter, less fruit-driven rosé than you can with a red wine. So rosé is possibly one of those styles of wine that is going to grow far more with climate change. But the amount of water being used is just growing all the time. So two other wines that I tried made from these traditional grapes that were planted originally. One was the Bastide des Songes Malbec that, oh, sorry, typo, sent grapes to the co-op until 2000. And interestingly, their range of grape varieties are archetypal IGP PADOC. And this Malbec, we have our ideas of Malbec. We maybe think of Cahors, we maybe think of Argentina. Caladoc, oh, Stephen's saying doesn't think of Caladoc as particularly disease resistant. It's interesting. It is what it is marketed as to the producers as being disease resistant. So whether it's diseases found locally in Languedoc, I don't know, but Coulier and parasites apparently. And that is the promotion done all the time. So Malbec, I was expecting either sort of much more tannic, or I remember Gerard Basset used to say Argentinian Malbec is strawberry yogurt. So I really wasn't too sure how this Malbec was going to be. Very fresh and vibrant, quite wild fruit zestiness, but with a bit of spritz to make it a very easygoing, young drinking wine. And I think that is quite important in Languedoc with some of these varieties that are less, that are not traditional to the area, is that producers with this liberty of expression idea don't have to make the Malbec in any particular style. They can choose to make it fruitier, less tannic, lighter. They're not looking for you to say, this is a Malbec like in Cahors or Argentina. This is very much a Languedoc, fresh fruity Malbec. And Tempranillo is being planted. It is being recommended as being fruity and aromatic. Not particularly good with the heat stress or acidity, but normally is being used in blends. There are a handful making 100% varietal Tempranillo and very easy, soft, fruity drinking red wines. So one of the things I wanted to actually find out about, but was unable to pin down anyone, is with IGP PAYDOC not being restricted to an appellation zone, is there more plantations, higher altitude, north facing, cooler areas? And that is not, there doesn't seem to be any statistics on that. But I spoke to a producer yesterday who makes some excellent, it's a Burgundian producer, Abbots and Delaunay, who makes quite a lot of wine in IGP PAYDOC. Jamel is one of them, the Abbots and Delaunay label. And he said he was increasingly looking at vineyards around Limoux, going much further south, much higher altitude. And as you can see, closeness to the mountains and snow is a big advantage. Whether we will see more at higher altitude, it would be very interesting to find out. So we're looking at altitude, we're looking at the Cevennes foothills and the Black Mountains here. We're looking at these slopes here. The coastal plain is hot, but it is cooled by quite humid maritime winds, and this is the sort of the central bit in the middle, which is sort of more of the hotter area. So Rosemary probably knows far more than I do whether people are moving to cooler places. That would be very interesting to find out.
I think if you look at the Terrasse du Larzac, I mean, there are a lot of those. That's one of the reasons of the popularity of the Terrasse du Larzac, is they sort of see it as being cooler. And
I remember speaking to a producer 2 years ago when I went with Sarah, and she was saying that we spoke to one vineyard who sort of said, hush, hush, my vineyards are above the appellation limit, but I'm not telling anyone, please don't write about it. So you kind of, oh, yes, okay, right, you know, we won't tell anyone. Yeah, so Paul's saying, yes, how surprised to see many new vineyards on the upper slopes. So I think it's one of those things where worthwhile exploring in some of those sort of cooler, shadowy bits. I know that is happening a lot in Provence. I was quite surprised how many IGP rosés from Provence were appearing in this month's tasting that were at higher altitude. And we're talking 600 meters in Provence, north-facing slopes to get that freshness. The trouble is with IGP wines is they don't have, or they do not seem to have, the attitude of appellations who are terribly keen on telling you about sites and locations. And IGPs just don't seem to want to tell you about this. You've really got to do a lot more discovery or know the producers. They're not yet at a level of understanding what they can offer, I feel. So that was the range of wines that I tried, that I'm sure if anyone is particularly interested as examples, IGP PAYDOC can do something about that or find some other examples of the wines. So yeah, so my conclusion, basically what we've just said, they're still very much focusing on this liberty of expression, any grapes, any style of wine, and how that has cornered the market. And I think maybe there needs to be a slight shift in approach in saying we have this, but it's not just about varietal creativity, but IGP PAYDOC is in an incredibly advantageous position right now in that it can adapt very quickly, and it is ready with the grape varieties and locations to adapt to climate change in a way that a lot of the local appellations can't. So yes, I'm terribly sorry I haven't come out with any sort of hard-hitting, punchy facts in this talk, but I hope I sort of provoked a bit of discussion or thoughts or ideas that can be followed a bit further on climate change and what's going on in a wider sense. And I'm just trying to do a full screen so I can see everyone. Okay, so thank you very much. And if there are any questions now.
Yes, thank you very much, Liz, for that insight into obviously influence of climate change on the different grape varieties in the region. I'm just wondering if anybody else has any questions for Liz to follow up on from her presentation. Is that you, Keith?
You're muted. So I'm presuming lack of questions is because that was just such a stunningly amazing, informative PowerPoint that no questions. As I say, I can give contact details of what's going on. Yeah, Nebbiolo and Touriga have already been approved. They are already in the list. But as I say, there is a bit of a turnaround unless a vineyard is actually about to plant. It may take a bit of time before it gets through to commercial acceptability. So we've got the 4 years after planting before it can be used. Not every pépinière will have the grape varieties ready and at hand. And what I discovered when I was writing about Marcelin was that producers were saying things like, yeah, we've planted it all, but now we have to learn how to use the grape variety. So there are quite a few producers, especially with the Marcelin, who would make some wine and kind of go, well, that completely bombed. We really didn't understand how that tannin was going to develop. We thought because Cabernet Sauvignon was a parent, we would make it like Cabernet Sauvignon, and it didn't work. So we've just back blended it into the rest of the red. So there's a lot of, it will take 4 or 5 years before producers sometimes understand how some of these new varieties work as well. And it's incredibly slow and it's terribly frustrating because we can see the potential of what might be happening. And we want, we want to sort of speed it up and try it. But the Neoluccio Rosé, when I was writing for the book in 2017, there was only one, and I've tasted 4 this year. So it is speeding up, it is coming along. Any views on whether blends should be encouraged more for more interesting wines? It's very difficult because I think IGP Paydock, their whole philosophy, I mean, they talk about their DNA being single variety wines and blends being for the appellation. So it's getting their mindset around it, even though I think there will be blends, with up to 15-20% of another variety, 30% blended in, but very much as a companion to a blend as opposed to 3 grapes in a blend. As I said, putting in maybe some aromatic grapes in, quite often a bit of Syrah blended into Grenache for rosé to give a bit of body. So it's a support grape as opposed to an overall blend. That's my feeling of what's happening.
So is it the Greek varieties that are likely to be accepted, next in the...
That was what I understood. Yes,
Yes.
they're all getting very excited and I think, great, go on holiday to Santorini and see how it works.
Yes.
That was the impression.
Yes, because somebody started the Certico in the Peak Saint Loup. I think it has actually made it. I have yet to
Oh, really?
I think, yes. I said I went to see a wine grower in Peak Saint Loup who had planted it. I'm sure I've read somewhere in the last month or so that it's actually been produced.
Oh, so it's obviously going to be a new one.
Yes.
I mean, Stephen's saying, yeah, most people plant new varieties with an eye on marketing. So what, with IGP Paydock, I would say that in a way, there are several strands to the way they do their marketing. There is this 85%, which has an eye on commercial varieties that they know will leap off the shelf, the Merlot, the Cabernet, the Chardonnay, and everything. And then there is the fifth of producers who are doing really exciting wines, heedless of what the grape varieties are. So there are people like Clos Santé who have 28 local historic.
He's got all the old grape varieties.
All the old
things you've
varieties.
never heard of, Riberank in various colours.
Exactly. which
Terra
people are
is-
very, very keen on. But you know, like their rosé has 10 Gris grape varieties that you've never heard of listed on the back label. So there are this quarter, this fifth or quarter of producers who are not looking to sell by the commercial variety, but are doing something more interesting. Yeah, Colombard definitely getting a new lease of life. And really, I mean, I was so shocked when I tasted the Colombard last night. I was kind of going, oh, that will go into the cooking. Yeah, I don't want to be rude. I really did not expect to get that lovely, great roundness from there. Right, sorry, from Lynn. A bit more about the Saignée. So Saignée is one of those horrible words that badly translates into English. So I still have vineyard leaflets from the 1980s that list their white wine, their red wine, and their bloody wine. And bloody being the Saignée, it is the juice bled off the press to make a lighter wine. So technically, every rosé that goes into a press, the juice is bled out of the press. Every rosé is Saignée. The thing that is important is it bled off a red wine that's in the press? And that is the crucial question. If it's bled off a red wine, the grapes are harvested later for red wine with a greater maturity, less acidity, and maybe a bit more phenolic tannic ripeness. Which was hence the question earlier, is it expressly a rosé, which is usually harvested 2 weeks earlier, the greater acidity and the freshness. But that verb saigner carries on whatever you do. It's what the wine in the press is that is really important. So one of the big problems is you speak to a producer and you say, is your rosé saignée? And they go, yeah, saignée, yeah, we take the juice out of the press. And you lose it. So I remember reading Robert Parker's description of how Tavel is made. And he fell into the trap because they said, we make our Tavel using saignée, which they do, but they don't make any red in Tavel. They just bled the juice out of the press. And it goes into his book that Tavel is made using saignée. And he didn't understand, and he digs himself into this pit that just gets deeper and deeper and deeper because he couldn't understand what they were telling him. So saignée is this faux ami. It is a verb, but you need to put it into the context of the winemaking to be able to understand it. When I said some of the saignée rosé that is good, I was thinking of saignée bled off the red wine. So if you have 10% saignée off your Grenache or Syrah red wine, even in Provence, they will sometimes do this. It gives the weight, that inner depth, to a lighter weight rosé. And it's such a small percentage, it doesn't affect the color or anything. It just gives that little boost of riper fruit. So, any other questions? I think one thing I'd like to just say, and maybe Rosemary would know better than me on this, I wouldn't say a lot of varietal wines in IGP Pays-Doc go into oak. They're very much into that purity. I mean, Chardonnay, yes, maybe some of the Pinot Noir, but from what I've tasted, there's a lot of purity of flavour that is their aim. Would you agree on that?
I think I would. I mean, because Patrick Schmidt did a tasting, as it was a Zoom with a tasting, and there were 8 wines, and he just showed one rosé that had been in oak as an example of that's how perhaps the people are sort of experimenting a bit and pushing the boundaries a bit rather than. But I tend to I think you think rosé is fresh fruit on the whole.
Yeah, there was this year I noticed far more rosé that had been in oak, but you only knew about the oak in terms of weight and structure, not in aromatics or flavour. So there's a lot of improved knowledge of use of oak going on for all of the wines. But oaked character is not really what people have been looking for on these. And I guess if you're going to have a rare grape variety, one of those lesser known grape varieties, are you really going to want to hide it behind oak? I wouldn't have thought, maybe Tempranillo, I don't know, but I would wonder about that. So yeah, but to be honest, finding the wines with some of these varieties is, you know, it's an Hercule Poirot sort of investigation, because there is a lot of promotion for the actual grape varieties, but to find the links and the direction to the wines with the unusual grape varieties is you need someone like Rosemary in your pocket all the time.
Or you.
Yes, well, it's yeah, it is. It's a bit like, you know, when people say, oh, can you recommend a Burgundy, and you go, no. So it has that sort of feeling with Languedoc. It's, you've got to know the producers for that.
That's for sure.
Well, I think on that note, a pocket-sized Rosemary or a pocket-sized Liz, I think the way forward with wines from the Pays d'Oc.
And next week, my rosé guide, which will be online, you can use on your phone in your pocket.
Well, there you are. There, you've done it, Liz. You produced the pocket.
I've done it. I've produced the pocket. Yes. So great.
Well, that's wonderful. Anyway, thank you very much, Liz, for all your time and all the work that you've put into putting forward this presentation for the members today, and obviously our guests as well. So thank you very much. And I'm sure if there's any other questions anybody has, they'll either pass them through to me and I'll pass them on as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Great.